Good morning, Grace Oviedo. How are we all doing? Doing well? Great. Well, my name is Mike Standish, and I am the student pastor at the Orlando campus. And I am so grateful for the opportunity to be here today. I'm thankful for Pastor Clint giving me that opportunity. It's actually my very first time here at the Oviedo campus. So thanks for welcoming me here. I got to hang out with some of your students last weekend at our Pause conference, and it was so awesome to see such a large group. Actually, a third of our students came from this Oviedo campus, which was so great. So I want to give a huge shout out to Kayla Jeffers. God is doing some really awesome things right now in students through her leadership. I'm really grateful for her. My wife and I have been at Grace for about 2.5 years. We moved from Ohio. My wife is a nurse. Her name's Erica. We got 2 kids, Kate, who's 8, and Henry, who is 5. We're at the stage right now in life where I play a lot of baby dolls and Legos. So that's what I do with my free time. Tons of fun. We just got a dog, actually, this last summer. His name is Murphy. And my son was telling me just a few days ago, Dad, Murphy is fast. I'm like, yeah, he is fast, bud. No, like, Dad, he's as fast as a cheetah. I was like, yeah, he's pretty fast. He's not that fast, bud. He's like, no, like, Dad, he's literally as fast as a cheetah. My son was convinced that if a cheetah and Murphy were running a race, they would run at the exact same speed. Now, we can laugh at that as adults because we know that dogs aren't that fast. Any runners out here? We had like 2 runners. Okay, we've got 2 runners now. This is not a running church. I feel like I fit in already. So I look like it. I'm skinny, but I'm not a runner. Chances are none of you guys either could run as fast as a cheetah. And how I know that is because we all have limitations. There are things that you cannot do that no amount of determination, no amount of hard work, no amount of just self-talk can get you there. Now, we live, though, in a culture that is built on this philosophy that if I try hard, I can do whatever I want to do, I can be whoever I want to be, so I need to just follow my heart. We were actually watching a Disney movie just yesterday, and here's one of the songs that was in the movie. It said, "Let your dreams take flight and your heart ignite. Did you know that it's true, that everything is possible? There's nothing we can't do. It's a wild and beautiful fire, and I believe in you." Now, it's nice, and I appreciate the sentiment of this, and in some ways, I will say, what I love about this generation, Gen Z, is they have dreams and they're going places that I believe my generation will never go. They have an enthusiasm, and they're not jaded by the world today. And I think the last thing we need to do is squash that. But I also recognize that there are limitations, that we can't simply do whatever we want to do and follow our heart. And I think living in America, we can sometimes have this idea of unrestrained deliberation freedom. No one's going to control our decisions. No one's going to tell us what to do because we are the land of the free and the brave. But we know that's actually not true. There are limitations to what we can do. And we don't have entire freedom. So I think the challenge we have is if we bring that hyper sense of freedom into how we read the Bible, then we're going to think sometimes that it's not fair if we can't decide whatever we want or control our own decisions. Today we're going to actually see how Paul addresses the idea of freedom, but he's going to do it from a different perspective and probably from an unexpected way. But before we jump right into the text, I want to do a little bit of a recap from last week because we are in verse 19, but Paul is in the middle of a train of thought. So let's jump back to what Pastor Clint talked about last weekend. And what he shared with us is that God is faithful. Verse 6 says, God's word is still faithful, and that just because he worked in a way that was unexpected and bringing Gentiles in and not all Israel truly believing in God doesn't make God unfaithful. It just means we didn't understand his plan. And part of his plan is that God chooses some to salvation. He calls and he elects them to salvation. And this can be difficult. It can be hard to understand that. But I think if we truly understand how that works, it shouldn't cause a sense of insecurity, but confidence. that God is a purposeful God who works and is weaving his intentions with intentionality. Things aren't just happening randomly, or they're not just happening based on how I choose to respond. But then we also looked at the idea that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And that's hard. It's like, well, what's going on there? But if you look at the Exodus passage, what we also see is that more times than not, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. I think the idea is that God gave Pharaoh what Pharaoh wanted. And one of the worst acts of judgment is God removing his mercy and giving us what we want. So knowing all of that, we're going to jump right into verse 19 because Paul's going to actually respond to all of that. And here's what he's going to say in Romans chapter 9, verse 19. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? So Paul likes to have these mock arguments. Like it's his way of like addressing like a counter argument, or even like the unexpressed thoughts that his audience might have. It's like you sharing a really difficult, some difficult news with someone, and as you share it, you can see it on their face, like, what in the world? And you're like, okay, I know what you're thinking right now, but let me explain. And that's kind of what Paul, I believe, is suggesting here. He knows he's just talked about the fact that God elects some to salvation, that God has hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he's like, I know what you're thinking. This person is like, don't tell me that God's the one that chooses and we're to blame? How does that work, Paul? From a human perspective, I get how this is difficult. But I think one of the things I've learned about reading and studying and interpreting the Word of God is that sometimes I don't understand the ways that God works. But if I don't understand it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, that it's not true. I can give you a number of illustrations. God is a Trinitarian God who exists as three persons in one God. I can't understand that, but it's true. Jesus is 100% God and 100% human at the exact same time. I don't understand how that happens, but it's true. I think the more difficult ones are the ones where we can't comprehend and it just doesn't seem fair. And what you would think Paul would do is actually say, okay, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about God's sovereignty, and let's talk about humans' free will, and let's see how they work together. And actually, that's not really the direction he goes. He goes actually a very different direction in answering the question. And it reminds me of like what Jesus does sometimes. Like Jesus was a brilliant communicator. Like people would come to him and ask him a question. He's like, no, like I'm going to answer it this way. So like you had the Herodians, they were this non-religious Jewish party who were sympathetic to the Roman government, supported Herod. And on the other end of the political spectrum, you had Pharisees. They were experts of the law who were very strict in their interpretation of the law. The one thing they had in common is they both hated Jesus. So they come to him to test him. They said, is it lawful for us to give our taxes to Caesar? If Jesus would have said yes, the Pharisees would have accused him as blasphemy. If he would have said no, the Herodians would have accused him as insubordinate to Rome. He doesn't say yes or no. He says, well, let's see. What's on this coin? Well, it looks like it's the face of Caesar. Give Caesar what's Caesar's and give God what's God's. And so they walked away, marveled at what he said. Because he knew how to address his audience. And I think I've learned this in ministry. This is a life lesson I've learned, like to assess and read the room. When someone's asking me a question, what's the motivation behind it? Like some people have a genuine desire to understand something. And they're not coming antagonistically. They're saying, help me. Like I don't understand this thing about God. I don't understand how he works in this way. And maybe some of you, that's where you're at today. Like maybe even you came back from last week and you're still just wrestling with this idea that God chooses some to salvation and you're just trying to understand it. I've also met people before where the moment they asked the question, I knew what was behind the question. It wasn't to learn, it was to argue. It was to prove a point, and I realized there's nothing I'm going to do to argue them into my position at this point. And I think understanding that, we can read verse 20 when it says this, "But who are you, O man, to answer back to God?" Now, it almost seems like Paul's a bit of a jerk. He's kind of like, who the heck do you think you are? God's boss, get over it. I don't think that's what he's actually implying here, but I almost wonder if Paul is responding with that response because of the person who would be asking the question. In verse 19, why does he still find fault? Almost responding to the person whose fist is in there and saying, how dare God blame us when he's the one who chooses? And Paul is responding a little bit more forcefully to the question. It's almost like when you say, how dare you question me back to your kids, right? There's like, question back is this idea of superiority. Like, I know better than you. And I think that's kind of the intent in this question. It's like, I know better than God. How dare he? But I will say this, that's not all people. I've got friends who have a different interpretation of election than I do, of God choosing, and the fist isn't in the air, they just see things differently. I think we're talking about a person who is offended and mad. And some of us go through situations that are just difficult. We can't understand why God is doing what he's doing. But what is interesting about how Paul answers this question is he's going to look from God's perspective. He's not going to answer the question of free will from the human perspective, but he's going to say, well, is God also not free? Because here's the thing about God. God is not tainted by sin. God is not constrained by time and by effort. So let's look at this conversation from God's perspective. And as we read Romans 9, 21 to 23, we're going to see that God indeed is free. I think of times in my own life when I've gone through suffering and I've tried so desperately to fix my situation. I remember one of those moments was when I was a sophomore in college. I'd come off an incredible freshman year. I feel like I had the friends that I wanted. I had the opportunities. I was a class president. I had all these opportunities. I went to camp as a camp counselor that summer, and God worked in big ways. Like, life was good for me. And then I come into that next year, and it's like he just ripped the carpet from out underneath me and like took everything away. Every opportunity I had, every friendship I had, and I was left alone. I was left in some days bitter, mad, because I didn't understand what God was doing in my life. What I didn't realize is I was so fixed on this one part of my life and didn't realize that God cared about that, but he actually cared about way more than I even did. That God was doing something in my life to make me the kind of person he wanted me to be. A person who's more sympathetic with people that I had never seen before until I was kind of alone like they were. A person who trusted God in new ways that I never had to before. And he allowed me to go through that because he's good and he was doing something that I didn't see. Some of you guys are going through some things maybe right now that are difficult. And you don't understand why God is doing what he's doing. And maybe if you're honest, you're having a hard time truly even believing that he's good. There's been times in my life where I've questioned God. And one thing I appreciate about the Psalms is we see a picture of honesty. We just finished a series in Grace Students called Anthem, and we looked at the Psalms and talked about this, what it is to worship God, really. And what I love about the Psalms is you see sometimes just raw questioning of God. You see it in several verses. I'm going to just highlight a few of them. Psalm 10, verse 1, it says, "Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" In 42, verse 9, it says, "Why have you forgotten me?" 44:24, "Why do you forget our affliction and oppression?" And I feel like there's times in my life I have said those same things to God because I didn't get it. But here's what I love about the Psalms. They're free to share what's on their heart, but he always comes back to what he knows to be true about God. Because in chapter 10, it also says this, "O Lord, you hear the desire of the afflicted. You will strengthen their heart. You will incline your ear." In chapter 42, he goes on to say, "Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God." 44, verse 8 says, "In God we have boasted continually, and he will give thanks, and we will give thanks to your name forever." Okay? He's saying, God, I don't get it. I feel like you've abandoned me, but here's what I do know to be true. You are God. You are good. And you are working when I don't always understand it. We challenge our students to write down the ways God's been good to them. Because here's what I know to be true in my own life. Sometimes I just need to be reminded of what he's done in the past. And when I actually stop and I'm reminded, it's sometimes the one thing that helps me say, okay, I believe he can do it again. I don't know how, but if he's been faithful in the past, he'll be faithful again, because that is God's character. So Paul gives this imagery to flesh out this idea of freedom, God's freedom. And here's what he says, starting in verse 21. "Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use?" He's going to use the imagery of like pottery and a clay. Like a potter and a clay. How many of you guys have shaped clay before? We have a few of you guys out there, right? Like you put it on this wheel and then like it turns around, and then as you mold your fingers together, it molds with you. I did it one time and failed immensely at that. Like it was not going in the way that I wanted it to go. But a good potter knows what he's doing. He moves his hands in such a way to say, I know that the end product is going to look this way. And I'm shaping it. And I'm in complete control so that it will be exactly what I want it to be. And at the end, you can stand back and be in awe of not just the artistry of what he's created, but who he is as an artist. Because there's glory in his work. But here's the hang-up. Here's the challenge. We have two verses that make it difficult to understand what is Paul saying. Verse 22 says, "What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory?" So the question is it suggesting that Paul is saying that God has created some people for destruction and he's created some people for mercy? But here's what verse 23 says. It says, "The riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory." And we've talked about this, that God has prepared vessels of mercy for glory. That God has chosen in his great love and his great mercy some to be saved. But what's interesting in verse 22, and taking a cue from Tim Keller, he says this, "He has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction." What we find there is there's no whom. By whom? Who has prepared the vessels of destruction? It doesn't suggest, it doesn't say God has. And I'm comfortable in the idea that the implication is we have prepared ourselves for destruction. Because here's what we know to be true. We're not born good people. We're not born neutral people. I am born a sinful human. Because of the decision of Adam and Eve, you and I have inherited that sinful nature that is passed down. If you got little kids, you know that you don't have to train them to be selfish. Like this weekend, I have had to help my kids learn to share. And I didn't say, "Henry, here's how it is to throw a royal fit. Here's how you can hit your sister." Like he learned it on his own because that's part of who he is. And really, what we know is like we're on a collision course towards destruction. That is where we are born, where we are headed. And just like God hardening Pharaoh's heart, Pharaoh also hardened his own heart. And God gave him over to that. And here's what's beautiful. God shows mercy to some, but we don't deserve it. Here's how I know that's true, because here's what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2. He says, "And you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind." So he's saying, like, we were dead. All of us who are now in Jesus were once dead. No spiritual life at all. And guess what? Dead people cannot bring themselves to life. That's an act of God. Dead people in Ephesians are described as those who follow their own sinful passions, who are the nature children of wrath. God does not engineer evil. If anything, God is long-suffering. God is merciful. God is actually patient with us, as Romans suggest, and as we'll see here in verse 4 and 5 of Ephesians 2. It says, "But God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved." God, in his rich mercy, chose to save us. And that leaves us with this feeling of awe that God would choose to even show mercy to some. Because here's what we know to be true. For him to show mercy, he sent his one and only Son. And one of the most unfair things really is that the God of the universe would send his Son to die for us, who is perfect. But that's what he did out of love for us. Pastor Clint used the analogy of the lottery. Some of you guys maybe were here last week when he shared that. Like if he won the lottery and he had $20 million, right? And if he did, I hope I'm on his list of people he would share it with. But he's like, okay, let's suggest I just share it with 5 people here. And they each get $1 million. That's pretty generous of him to give away that much money to those people, because it wasn't theirs. And he's showing mercy and grace by very fact of giving it away to them. So here's what we know. God can display his glory in ways that we don't always comprehend. God was working in my life as a sophomore in college. I didn't see it. I didn't understand it, and it didn't make sense to me what I was experiencing. But what I know is God was doing something bigger than me, and it didn't make God unjust because I didn't understand what he was doing. It just means he was God and I wasn't. You and I we're more than programmed robots. We can be creative, we can plan, we can prepare. Proverb actually says in chapter 16, verse 9, "The heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." And here's what I love about that. Part of what makes our faith strong is that God is God and we are not. He is the one who's guiding my steps. Man, and I am grateful that I serve a God who is in control, who's so purposeful in the way that he's working on my life. And that life is not just a bunch of random facts that are random series of events that are happening. Because I'm telling you right now, if the suffering that I experienced as a sophomore and that I've also experienced as an adult, and things even much more difficult than that, were just random things that happened because of a bad decision, there's no meaning in that. It's even sweeter when we go through hard times like that to know that there's a God who's in complete control, who's working out things that I never could plan for myself. And I hope wherever you're at today, you can believe that in whatever you're facing. That God is in control. The danger and the temptation, I think, for me is when things are hard to then fail to press into what that is. Let me illustrate this. There's things that are hard in the Bible that we can't explain. And one of the things that my conviction that I want for our students is that they put their feet firmly in the Word of God. And when they're convinced that God's Word says this, they then figure out, how do I now live that out, even if it's difficult, even if other people don't agree with me. But the temptation is that we say, well, maybe this is true, or maybe this is true. And let's figure out how the Bible can make this say what it does. Because I'd rather go this direction. But God is like, just trust me. If you are reading the Word and you believe it says this, then trust me, even if you can't understand it all. So we've seen that God is free. As we keep moving on through the next few verses, what we're going to see is that God is not only free, but He is faithful. He's going to pivot. Paul's going to pivot a little bit from the direction he's currently taken. He's going to unpack God's plan of salvation, not only for the remnant of Jews, but also the Gentiles as well. And what he does in verse 6 is he's already addressed the idea that God, including Gentiles, was part of his plan. It wasn't because plan A failed and now he has to readjust and go to plan B, but that God works in ways that we don't always see. I'm reminded of this video that I've shared before to some students. And it's a video that has these people who are passing a basketball. And the screen says, count how many times the basketball is passed. So you're like intently watching every time it's passed and you're counting. And then what happens is in the midst of that, this dude dressed like a gorilla just like walks across the stage, the screen. And then the question pops up, how many times did the basketball get passed? And usually most people get it right. They're like, yes! Did you see the gorilla? What gorilla? It's like so crazy. Like literally when you watch it again, then you go back and watch, you're like, he was literally right in front. But the fact is you don't see him because you're not looking for him. And that's what's happened here. So much of what was missed was God's people weren't looking for what God had said all along. That was God's plan all along. Because God works in mysterious ways. He's full of surprising reversals. We can see that in a number of ways, like Abraham and Sarah having a child at age 90. Jacob serving, Esau, the older brother, serving Jacob, the younger brother. Joseph going through trial after trial after trial, all for a reason, that he would be in Egypt, second in command. So when there's a severe famine in the land, he would be the one to provide for God's people. Moses, a man who couldn't even speak, who had a stuttering problem, was the person who was going to go with his brother to Pharaoh and say, bring my people back. And then when we went into the land and they began to conquer it, the God said, I just want you to march around this city called Jericho. Just march with these trumpets. And that would bring the walls down. And they're entering the land. They finally have a king. They have a king and a new king. And it's this shepherd boy that everyone else was going to pass over, and it was David. And then God then brings 12 people together when Jesus comes on the scene to be his men who will be the leaders of the church. Like, God doesn't always work in ways that we expect him to work. He is much bigger than us. And here's what we see Paul do. He's going to use two Old Testament prophets, Hosea and Isaiah, in chapter 24 through 29. Verse 25, it says this, as indeed he says in Hosea, those who are not my people, I will call my people, and her who is not beloved, I will call beloved. In the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they will be called the sons of the living God. So in Hosea's time, this was a promise delivered to the 10 tribes, the northern kingdom. You who were rebellious and disobedient, I will call to be my people. Paul picks this up and actually uses it to address the Gentiles. You were not this way, but here's who you are now. You are my people. You are beloved. You are my sons and daughters. And man, what incredible statements of belonging that there are in those few words. You are part of the family. And you're part of the family not because you did anything, but because I chose you to be a part of my family. Man, that has so much greater meaning. Knowing that God has chosen me to be part of his family. The identity in that is huge. But we all wrestle with identity, don't we? Like if you're a parent, how well do your kids perform in sports or the honor roll? Or were they in last month's baptism? Like all the time in social media, like I got more likes, more comments, more followers, therefore I have more value. I get a job promotion, so now I have a sense of worth. Or if I don't, maybe I don't, right? Like so much of our life is built on these false sense of identity when we can understand that God says, no, it's what I say about you that matters. I call you. I call you son and daughter. I call you beloved. I call you my people. And that gives us hope. And in verse 27 to 29, he then references the prophet Isaiah, who's talking about those who went into Assyrian captivity. And because God is faithful, God will see his promises through. They won't have complete destruction. His people will experience his blessing. The remnant will come out of the land because he promised his faithfulness to his people, Israel. So what these few verses are helping us understand is that God has a plan for salvation that includes a remnant of Israel, and it includes Gentiles, and that has been his plan all along. And then here's how he closes. He closes in verses 30 to 33 with this big idea that God is not only free and faithful, but he is our foundation. What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it? That is a righteousness that is by faith. But that Israel who pursued a law that it would lead to righteousness did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith. But as if it were based on works, they have stumbled over the stumbling stone. As it were written, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. There's a great irony here. Those who knew most about God in the end did not come to know God. Those who knew the least about God in the end came to know God. Those who most wanted to be righteous ended up being sinful, being separated from God. Those who least wanted to be righteous ended up being holy and blameless before God. Why? Because they responded in faith, or they responded by works. He said the Gentiles simply responded to Jesus in faith. The Jews, however, responded, they pursued righteousness based on their own effort. And we live in the coexist world today, right? Like maybe you've seen that bumper sticker. And, I think the idea behind it is just like a sense of unity, which I think today more than ever we need, to be more kind. Just be what God calls us to be. But if we kind of press in a little bit deeper, coexist fails significantly in this way. It's not just if you want to follow Muhammad, then that works for you. If you follow Jesus, hey, that's cool. That works for you. When God is saying, my perfect plan, I sent my one and only son to die, to be the ransom, to be the sacrifice. And if you come to me in faith, not based on anything you did, but based on what he did, I will save you. And if today you're like, I'm having a hard time with this whole election thing, and I'm a little worried and I'm concerned, like the fact that you are probably there is a good sign that there's a soft heart, that maybe the Spirit is working in your heart. He uses the analogy of like a stumbling stone. So like, think of a rock. I went to Africa a couple times, and the roads there are pretty treacherous. We got off-road several times once, but imagine there's this massive rock, which we saw many times, and you're going over that full speed, and you just hit that rock, and your car flips. To that person, it was an offense. It was a stumbling. But imagine your scenario where there is a giant rock in the road, but here's what's happened to the road. It's becoming flooded, and more water is coming, and literally, that is the only thing you're holding on to so you don't float away. That rock is your hope. And that's what Jesus wants from all of us. You see, God is a God who is free to act. And he's unconstrained by the constraints we have. He wants us to live on mission. Here's what he wants. He wants you to be more concerned about your lost friend who doesn't know Jesus than if they're elect or not. He wants you to just go be faithful. and help them know that he loves them. William Carey, one of the first modern missionaries, believed that God sovereignly chose some for salvation, but guess what? He went passionately after people. It didn't make him think, well, if God's figured it out, I don't need to be used. He said, no, two things are important, work and prayer. I pray because God knows who will be saved, but I work hard. We show up where we can show up, and God shows up where he can show up. God is also not only free, but God is faithful. You can trust when you don't understand things, trust and press into his character, that he's a good God and will work in good ways. But God is also our foundation. Never get over his grace. If you've been saved for 20 years, I pray today would be just as much an appreciation, the fact that God saved you in the very first day. Man, if God hasn't saved you and you haven't entered into a relationship with him, that maybe today is the very first day. You could come and receive this gift that God has for you, that you could be part of the family of God. Will you join me in prayer? God, we love you and thank you that you are a God who is free to act as you will. And the reason we can trust you and be okay with that is because you're a good God. You do things that we don't understand, and that doesn't make it bad. It, Lord, just means that you're God and I'm not. I pray that you would help us to all trust you more with the things that we experience in this life. And we go through times of suffering, maybe some right now are in that point. I pray that they would be able to see that you're a faithful God in the midst of that. Lord, I pray that every one of us never get over your wonderful grace and mercy. It's in your son's name I pray. Amen.